A 6-year-old girl was taken from her own front yard in broad daylight, and what happened next would haunt an entire community for over 2 decades. Before we dive in, leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow, we've got another mind-blowing story for you. It was June 14th, 2003, one of those blazing Arizona afternoons when the heat rises off the pavement in waves and the air feels thick enough to choke on. In the small town of Yuma, just miles from the Mexican border, life moved at its own pace. The desert surrounded everything, vast and unforgiving, a landscape that swallowed sound and secrets with equal indifference. Neighborhoods were tight-knit, built on familiarity and routine, where everyone knew everyone, and children played outside until the streetlights came on. That Saturday felt like any other. Families were home for the weekend, yards filled with the sound of sprinklers fighting against the dry heat and distant laughter echoing between stucco houses. For the Calderon family, it was supposed to be a quiet day. Mia Calderon, 6 years old, with dark eyes that sparkled with mischief, and a smile that could light up a room, had spent the morning watching cartoons with her older brother Danny, who was 9. Their mother, Rosa, was inside preparing lunch. The smell of beans and rice drifting through the small 2-bedroom house on East 16th Street, mixing with the hum of an old box fan that barely cut through the heat. Their father, Miguel, had left early that morning for his shift at the warehouse where he'd worked for the past 8 years, loading trucks and managing inventory. It was the kind of neighborhood where screen doors stayed open and kids rode bikes up and down the block without supervision. Safe, familiar, home. The kind of place where nothing bad ever happened, or so people thought. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, Mia asked her mother if she could go outside to play. The cartoons had ended, and she was restless, bouncing on the couch with the boundless energy only 6-year-olds possess. Rosa glanced out the window at the front yard, saw Danny already out there tossing a football against the side of the house, the repetitive thud echoing in the stillness. She told Mia yes, reminding her to stay in the yard, not to go past the fence, and to come in when she called. Mia nodded enthusiastically, her ponytail bouncing as she ran out the door in her pink shorts and white sneakers, the screen door slamming behind her. Rosa watched her through the window for a moment, smiling at the sight of her daughter running across the patchy grass, then turned back to the stove, where rice was beginning to bubble. It was 2:37 p.m. By 3:15, Mia was gone. Danny came running inside, his face pale, his voice shaking with something that sounded like fear. He told his mother that Mia wasn't in the yard anymore. Rosa dropped the wooden spoon she'd been holding, the clatter against the linoleum, floor sharp and final. She ran outside, calling Mia's name, her voice rising in pitch with each repetition. The street was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels wrong, that settles in your chest like a weight. She checked the backyard, the side of the house, the neighbor's driveway. Nothing. She shouted louder, her voice cracking, echoing off the stucco walls of the houses that lined the block. Neighbors began stepping out of their homes, drawn by the panic in her voice, by the primal fear that every parent recognizes. Within minutes, a dozen people were searching the block, looking under cars, behind bushes, knocking on doors, calling Mia's name into the empty air. By 3:30, someone had called the police. The first officers arrived at 3:42 p.m., their patrol car rolling down East 16th Street with lights, but no siren. They took statements from Rosa, from Danny, from neighbors who'd been outside. Danny told them he'd been playing on the far side of the yard, his back turned for just a few minutes, while he practiced throwing the football against the wall. When he looked up, Mia wasn't there. He thought she'd gone inside to use the bathroom or get a drink of water. He didn't hear a scream, didn't see a car, didn't notice anything unusual. One moment she was there, crouched in the dirt, examining a line of ants marching across the walkway, and the next she wasn't. The officers radioed for backup and began a systematic door-to-door canvass. Within an hour, the Yuma Police Department had mobilized a full search operation. They brought in tracking dogs, helicopters from the County Sheriff's Department, and volunteers from neighboring towns who'd heard the call go out on police scanners. The Calderon home became the center of a scene no parent should ever witness. Police tape cordoned off the front yard, yellow plastic fluttering in the hot breeze. Detectives walked the property with cameras and evidence bags, documenting every inch of ground. Rosa sat on the front steps, her hands clasped together, whispering prayers in Spanish, her lips moving but no sound emerging except the occasional sob. Miguel arrived home just before 5 p.m., still wearing his work uniform, his shirt dark with sweat. The moment he turned onto East 16th Street and saw the police cars, the neighbors gathered in clusters, the tape across his front yard, he knew. His knees buckled. An officer caught him before he fell, guided him to sit beside Rosa on the steps. They held each other and wept while strangers searched for their daughter. By evening, the story had spread across Yuma like wildfire. News crews set up outside the house, their cameras pointed at the small chain-link fence where Mia had last been seen. Reporters asked questions the family couldn't answer, microphones thrust toward Rosa's tear-stained face. Where was she? Who took her? How could this happen in broad daylight? The police had no answers either, not yet. What they did have were fragments, pieces of a puzzle that didn't yet form a complete picture. A neighbor 2 houses down, Mrs. Alvarez, told detectives she'd been watering her plants around 2:45 p.m. when she noticed a white sedan driving slowly down the street. She didn't think much of it at the time. People drove through the neighborhood all the time, looking for addresses or just cutting through to avoid the main roads. But something about the car stuck with her. It had out-of-state plates, maybe California, maybe Nevada. She couldn't be sure. The car had slowed near the Calderon house, then turned the corner and disappeared. She hadn't seen the driver, couldn't even say if it was a man or a woman. Just a white car moving too slowly for someone who knew where they were going. Another neighbor, a teenage boy named Carlos, said he'd been sitting on his porch around 3 p.m. when he saw a man walking down the sidewalk. The man was tall, maybe in his 30s or 40s, wearing jeans and a dark baseball cap pulled low over his face. Carlos didn't recognize him, which was unusual in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other, where new faces stood out. The man had glanced toward the Calderon yard. A quick look, nothing that seemed particularly suspicious at the time. Then he kept walking, his hands in his pockets. Carlos went inside shortly after to get away from the heat and didn't see where the man went. By the time detectives spoke to him, he couldn't remember any more details. What kind of shoes was the man wearing? What color was his shirt? Was he carrying anything? Carlos couldn't say. The memory had already started to blur. The details were thin, but they were all the police had to work with. By nightfall, search teams had combed through a 5-block radius, expanding outward in concentric circles from the Calderon house. They checked abandoned buildings, vacant lots, drainage ditches, and the desert scrub that bordered the eastern edge of town. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through fields of creosote and mesquite, calling Mia's name into the darkness, their voices swallowed by the vast emptiness. The helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights cutting through the night like white knives, illuminating patches of dirt and shadow but finding nothing. No sign of a little girl in pink shorts and white sneakers. No discarded clothing, no footprints leading away from the house, no evidence that she'd ever left that front yard. By midnight, the search was suspended until morning. Detectives told the family to go inside, to rest, though no one believed they would. Rosa refused to leave the porch. She sat there all night, wrapped in a blanket someone had brought her, staring at the empty yard, waiting for her daughter to come home. The next morning, Sunday, June 15th, the search resumed at dawn. This time, the FBI was involved. The case had been classified as a suspected abduction, triggering federal jurisdiction. Special agents arrived from the Phoenix field office to assist the ZOR local police, bringing with them resources and expertise that the small Yuma department didn't have. They set up a command center at the Yuma Police Department, a room filled with maps and computers and phones that rang constantly. They began analyzing every piece of information that had come in overnight. Tips were already flooding the hotline. Dozens of calls, most well-intentioned, but ultimately useless. Someone claimed to have seen a little girl matching Mia's description at a gas station 40 miles away, holding hands with a man who looked nervous. Officers drove out immediately, sirens blaring, only to find that it was another child with her father. Another caller reported seeing a white sedan parked near a motel off Interstate 8. But by the time police arrived, the car was gone, if it had ever been there at all. Every lead was followed, every tip investigated, but none of them brought Mia home. Detectives interviewed the family again, this time more thoroughly, more invasively. They asked Rosa to walk them through the entire day, minute by minute, detail by detail. What time did Mia wake up? What did she eat for breakfast? What was her mood like? Had she mentioned anything unusual, talked about any strangers, said anything that might seem innocent at the time but significant now? Rosa answered every question, her voice hoarse from crying, trying to remember every small detail of what turned out to be the last normal day of her life. They asked Miguel about his work schedule, his co-workers, anyone who might have had access to the house or information about the family's routines. Had anyone asked about his children? Had he noticed anyone following him home from work? Miguel couldn't think of anything. They asked Danny to repeat his story, over and over, from slightly different angles, looking for inconsistencies that might suggest he was hiding something or had seen more than he remembered. There were none. The family was cooperative, devastated, desperate. Still, procedure demanded that the investigators rule out the possibility of family involvement. Statistics showed that most child abductions were committed by family members or people close to the family. Rosa and Miguel both agreed to polygraph tests. Both passed. The focus shifted outward. By Monday, Mia's face was everywhere. Flyers papered every telephone pole, every storefront window, every bulletin board in town. Her school photo, the one taken just 2 months earlier, where she smiled shyly at the camera, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, stared out from hundreds of pieces of paper. Local news stations ran her photo on a loop, interrupting regular programming with urgent updates that contained no new information. National media picked up the story, CNN and Fox News, running segments about the missing Arizona girl, interviewing experts about child abductions and stranger danger. The FBI released a composite sketch based on Carlos's description of the man he'd seen walking down the street, but it was maddeningly generic. A tall figure in a baseball cap, with no distinguishing features. It could have been anyone. It could have been no one. Tips continued pouring in, hundreds of them, each one logged and investigated, and ultimately leading nowhere. Days turned into weeks. The search scaled back, then down to almost nothing. The helicopters stopped flying. The volunteers went home. The media moved on to other stories, other tragedies. But for Rosa and Miguel, time stopped on June 14th, 2003. Every morning, Rosa woke up expecting to hear Mia's voice, that high-pitched, excited chatter that used to fill the house. Every night, she left the porch light on, a beacon in the darkness, just in case Mia was out there somewhere, trying to find her way home. She kept Mia's room exactly as it had been. The bed made with the purple comforter Mia had picked out herself. The stuffed animals lined up on the shelf. The drawings taped to the wall, crude crayon sketches of the family, stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. Nothing was touched. Nothing was moved. It became a shrine to a little girl who might never come back. Every case you hear on this channel isn't just a story. It's weeks of research, cross-checking facts, verifying records, and piecing together fragments of real lives that were lost. Each episode takes us nearly 15 to 20 days of work, long nights, quiet hours, and countless moments spent chasing the truth. We do this because these stories matter, and because somewhere out there, someone deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, then please take a second to subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments what part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support isn't just a number, it's the reason we keep going. Now, let's get back to the case. The first weeks after Mia's disappearance were a blur of interviews, press conferences, and dead ends that led nowhere but deeper into despair. Detective Sarah Ortiz, the lead investigator assigned to the case, had worked missing person cases before during her 15 years with the Yuma Police Department. She'd found lost hikers in the desert, located runaway teenagers hiding with friends, reunited families torn apart by custody disputes. But something about this case felt different from the start. The lack of evidence, the clean getaway, the brazenness of taking a child in broad daylight from her own front yard, while her brother played just yards away, it all pointed to someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who had planned this, who had watched and waited for exactly the right moment. Someone who understood how to make a little girl disappear without leaving a trace. Ortiz spent hours in her office, the walls covered with maps and photos and timelines, reviewing the witness statements again and again, trying to piece together a coherent narrative from the scraps of information they had. Mrs. Alvarez had seen the white sedan at 2:45 p.m., driving slowly past the Calderon house. Carlos had seen the man in the baseball cap around 3:01 p.m., walking down the sidewalk, glancing at the yard. Danny had noticed Mia was gone by 3:10 p.m., though he couldn't say exactly when she'd disappeared. Somewhere in that 25-minute window, someone had taken her. But how? And more importantly, who? There were no signs of struggle in the yard, no screams that neighbors heard, no indication that Mia had resisted. Either she'd gone willingly with someone she knew, or she'd been taken so quickly and quietly that she didn't have time to react. The composite sketch of the man Carlos had seen was distributed to every law enforcement agency in Arizona and the surrounding states. Copies were sent to police departments in California, Nevada, New Mexico, and Texas. It was posted online, circulated on the news, shown on America's Most Wanted. Detectives pulled records of registered sex offenders in Yuma County, compiling a list of known predators who lived within a 50-mile radius of the Calderon home. Then they expanded the search to include all of southern Arizona and parts of California and Nevada, anywhere someone might have driven from that Saturday afternoon. The list grew to over 200 names. Each one was investigated. Each one was interviewed. Nearly all of them were cleared within the first month. Alibis confirmed. Polygraphs passed. No connection to the case whatsoever. A few remained on the suspect list, names that couldn't be completely ruled out. One was a man named Richard Brewer, a 42-year-old transient with a history of child molestation stretching back to the 1980s. Brewer had been seen in Yuma around the time Mia disappeared, though no one could pin down exactly where he'd been on June 14th. He lived in his car, moving from town to town, picking up odd jobs, and staying just long enough to avoid drawing attention. When police finally tracked him down 2 weeks after Mia's disappearance, living in his car behind a truck stop outside Tucson, they brought him in for questioning. Brewer was nervous, evasive, his answers vague and contradictory. "Where were you on June 14th? "I don't know. I'm not good with dates." "Do you remember being in Yuma?" "Maybe." "I've been a lot of places." "Did you see a little girl that day?" "I don't remember." Brewer had no alibi that could be verified, no one who could vouch for his whereabouts. But there was also no physical evidence linking him to the crime, no witnesses who could place him near the Calderon house, and no proof he'd ever owned a white sedan. Without more, without something concrete, detectives had to let him go. As the investigation dragged on through the summer and into fall, the FBI brought in behavioral analysts from Quantico to try to understand who might have taken Mia and why. The profile they developed, based on decades of research into child abduction cases, painted a disturbing picture. The abductor was likely a male in his 30s or 40s, someone with a sexual interest in prepubescent children. He would have been watching Mia for days or even weeks before making his move, learning her routine, the family's schedule when she was most vulnerable. He would have known the neighborhood layout intimately, known which houses had clear sight lines to the street, which times of day offered the most cover. The fact that he'd taken her in broad daylight suggested confidence bordering on arrogance, possibly stemming from prior experience with similar crimes. The profilers warned that whoever took Mia was dangerous, that she was likely in grave danger, if she was even still alive. That assessment hung over the investigation, like a dark cloud that wouldn't lift. Rosa refused to believe it, couldn't allow herself to accept that her daughter might be dead. She clung to hope with a desperation that was painful to witness, convincing herself that Mia was out there somewhere, maybe scared, maybe hurt, but alive, waiting to be found, waiting to come home. Even as the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years, Rosa's hope never completely died. She kept Mia's room exactly as it had been, dust settling on the stuffed animals and the crayons scattered across the small desk. Every year on Mia's birthday, Rosa baked a cake and sang happy birthday alone in the kitchen, lighting candles and making a wish that her daughter would be returned to her. She never stopped looking for Mia's face in crowds, never stopped scanning playgrounds and shopping malls, searching for that familiar smile among strangers. Miguel tried to move forward, tried to be strong for Danny, but the weight of not knowing what had happened to his daughter crushed him slowly, day by day. He started drinking to numb the pain, cheap whiskey that burned going down but dulled the sharp edges of grief. He lost his job at the warehouse after showing up drunk one too many times, unable to focus on work when his mind was always somewhere else. Replaying that Saturday afternoon, wondering what he could have done differently. If he'd been home instead of at work, would Mia still be safe? Could he have protected her? The guilt ate at him from the inside. Eventually, he left. The marriage couldn't survive what had happened, couldn't withstand the weight of shared trauma and unspoken blame. By 2005, Rosa and Miguel were divorced, their family fractured beyond repair. Danny, now 12 years old and struggling with his own guilt about not protecting his sister, moved in with his father across town, leaving Rosa alone in the house where Mia had been taken. Detective Ortiz never gave up on the case, even as other assignments piled up on her desk, even as the file on Mia Calderon was moved from her active cases to a filing cabinet in the cold case unit. She kept coming back to it, reviewing the evidence every few months, hoping to see something she'd missed, some detail that would crack the case wide open. She drove past the Calderon house sometimes on her days off, parking down the street and watching the windows, the yard, remembering. In 2007, she got a call from the FBI about a possible connection to another case. A 6-year-old girl had been abducted from a playground in Las Vegas, Nevada, in broad daylight. The circumstances were eerily similar. No witnesses, no screams. A white sedan seen in the area shortly before the girl disappeared. But unlike Mia, this girl had been found 3 days later, alive, abandoned in a park 50 miles from where she'd been taken. The girl, whose name was withheld from the press, had been traumatized beyond measure, barely able to speak about what had happened to her. She'd been examined by doctors and interviewed by specialists trained in working with child victims, but she couldn't provide much detail about her abductor. She remembered being grabbed from behind while playing on the swings, a hand over her mouth, being carried to a car. She remembered darkness and fear. She remembered crying and being told to be quiet. But there was one thing she remembered clearly, a detail that made Ortiz's heart race when she heard it. The man had a scar on his left hand, a jagged line running from his thumb to his wrist, like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. Ortiz immediately thought of Richard Brewer. She pulled his file from the archives, hands trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages, and there it was. In the arrest records from one of his prior convictions, a note about identifying marks. Scar on left hand, approximately 4 inches long, from a workplace accident. The description matched. Ortiz called the FBI, told them about Brewer, about his history, about the fact that he'd been in Yuma when Mia disappeared. The FBI brought Brewer in for questioning, this time with more leverage, more pressure. They told him about the Las Vegas case, about the similarities, about the fact that they now had DNA evidence collected from the Nevada girl's clothing, from her hair, from the car where she'd been held. If that DNA matched Brewer, he was going away for a very long time, possibly for the rest of his life. Brewer sat across from them in the interrogation room at the Las Vegas FBI field office, sweating despite the air conditioning, his hands trembling as he chain-smoked cigarettes and avoided eye contact. The detectives pressed him for hours, laying out the evidence, painting a picture of his guilt, telling him it would be better if he just confessed, if he told them where Mia Calderone was. Brewer said nothing for a long time, just stared at the table, at his scarred left hand resting on the metal surface. Then he looked up and asked for a lawyer. The interview ended. Brewer was released, pending DNA results, free to walk out of the building and disappear into the crowds of Las Vegas. The DNA results came back 6 weeks later, 6 weeks that felt like an eternity to Ortiz and the Calderone family. No match. Richard Brewer was not the man who had abducted the girl in Las Vegas. The DNA belonged to someone else, someone who had never been identified, who had left no trace in any criminal database. And without any physical evidence linking Brewer to Mia Calderone, without witnesses or a confession, he walked free once again. Ortiz was devastated. She'd been so certain, so convinced that Brewer was their man. The scar, the history, the timeline, it all fit. But the evidence didn't lie. Brewer wasn't the one. The case went cold again, colder than before. The trail had long since gone dead. Any evidence that might have existed had been contaminated or lost in the weeks and months after Mia's disappearance. Without new leads, without new information, there was nowhere else to go. Years passed, slow and painful for Rosa, who aged decades in the span of them. Mia's 10th birthday came and went, then her 15th. Rosa celebrated each one alone, baking cakes that no one would eat, singing to an empty room. Then Mia's 20th birthday arrived in 2017, and Rosa sat at her kitchen table with tears streaming down her face, wondering if her daughter was even still alive, if she was out there somewhere celebrating her own birthday, or if she'd been dead for 14 years, her body hidden in some unknown place, her fate a mystery that would never be solved. Detective Ortiz retired in 2019 after 30 years with the Yuma Police Department. On her last day, she stood in front of the cold case files, looking at the thick folder labeled Calderone, Mia, and felt like she was abandoning her. But before she left, she made sure the case was transferred to someone she trusted, a younger detective named Marcus Cole, who'd worked with her on several cold cases over the years and who had a reputation for never giving up. Cole promised Ortiz he'd keep working it, keep looking for answers, keep Mia's case active. And he did. In 2021, advances in DNA technology and the explosion of consumer genealogy databases opened new possibilities for solving old cases that had seemed hopeless. The same techniques that had been used to catch the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, after decades of him evading capture, were now being applied to cold cases across the country. Cole submitted DNA evidence collected from Mia's clothing, from the toys she'd been playing with in the yard that day, to a private genealogy lab that specialized in forensic work. The lab used genetic genealogy comparing the unknown DNA against millions of profiles uploaded to public ancestry websites, looking for familial matches that could narrow down the identity of whoever had left traces at the scene. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was something, a chance, however slim, to finally get answers after nearly 2 decades. Months passed with no results, and Cole began to lose hope that the technique would work. Maybe there wasn't enough DNA. Maybe whoever had taken Mia had no relatives in the genealogy databases. Maybe they'd hit another dead end. Then in early 2023, Cole got a call from the lab that changed everything. They had a match, not a direct match to a suspect, which would have been too much to hope for, but a familial match to someone in the genealogy database. The DNA from Mia's clothing belonged to a man whose second cousin had uploaded their genetic profile to a public ancestry website, curious about their family history, completely unaware that their DNA would help solve a 20-year-old kidnapping case. Using that information as a starting point, the lab built a family tree, tracing lineages back through generations, identifying common ancestors, and then working forward to narrow down the possible suspects. It was painstaking work that took months, but eventually they narrowed it down to a handful of men in the right age range who had lived in Arizona or Southern California in 2003. One name stood out immediately when Cole saw it on the list. David Allen Fletcher, a 58-year-old man living in a small town outside Phoenix. Fletcher had a criminal record, though nothing involving children. Minor offenses, mostly: theft, assault, driving under the influence, the kind of crimes that suggested a life lived on the margins. But what made Cole's pulse quicken was the discovery that Fletcher had lived in Yuma, briefly, in the early 2000s, working construction jobs under the table, cash in hand, no official records. Cole dug deeper, pulling every piece of information he could find on Fletcher. He found that Fletcher had owned a white 1998 Honda Accord in 2003, matching the general description of the car Mrs. Alvarez had seen. He also found employment records, spotty and incomplete, that showed Fletcher had been working on a construction site less than 3 miles from the Calderon home in June 2003. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture that made Cole's hands shake as he assembled the case file. Cole and a team of detectives drove to Phoenix in March 2023 to interview Fletcher, bringing with them a warrant for a DNA sample and enough evidence to make an arrest if the interview went wrong. They found him living in a run-down trailer park on the outskirts of the city, a place where broken-down cars sat on blocks and barking dogs strained against chains. Fletcher's trailer was one of the worst, rust eating through the metal siding, windows covered with aluminum foil, trash piled up around the edges. When they knocked on his door, Fletcher answered in a stained undershirt, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his eyes red-rimmed and suspicious. Cole identified himself and asked if they could talk. Fletcher looked at the badge, at the other detectives standing behind Cole, and shrugged. "Sure, why not?" he said, as if cops showing up at his door was a routine occurrence. The inside of the trailer was worse than the outside. It smelled of mildew and tobacco and something else, something sour and rotten. Dirty dishes were piled in the sink, and the small fold-out table was covered with empty beer cans and overflowing ashtrays. The detective sat across from Fletcher at the table, and Cole began asking questions, starting easy, building up. "Where were you on June 14th, 2003? Do you remember living in Yuma back then? Did you own a white Honda Accord? Fletcher's answers were vague, non-committal, the responses of someone who'd learned over the years how to talk to police without saying anything of substance. He said he didn't remember much from back then, that he'd been drinking heavily during those years, burning through his days in an alcoholic haze, and a lot of it was just a blur of forgotten moments and regrettable decisions. Then Cole pulled out a photo of Mia Calderon, the same school picture that had been on flyers and news broadcasts for 20 years, and placed it on the table in front of Fletcher. He watched Fletcher's face carefully, looking for any reaction, any micro-expression that might give him away. Fletcher stared at the photo for a long moment, his nicotine-stained fingers trembling slightly. Then he looked away, took a drag on his cigarette, and said quietly that he didn't recognize her. Cole pressed harder, leaning forward, his voice taking on an edge. He told Fletcher about the DNA evidence, about the genealogy match, about the white Honda Accord that placed him in Yuma at the exact time Mia disappeared. He told him they had enough to get a warrant for his DNA, and that when it came back as a match to the evidence collected from Mia's clothing, he'd be arrested and charged with kidnapping and murder. Fletcher sat in silence for a long time, staring at the table, at his scarred hands. Then he stubbed out his cigarette and said, "I think I want a lawyer." 2 days later, detectives returned with a court-ordered DNA sample. Fletcher complied without resistance, understanding that fighting it would only delay the inevitable. He swabbed the inside of his cheek and handed the sample over to the technician, then went back inside his trailer and closed the door. The wait for the results felt endless, each day dragging by with agonizing slowness. Cole checked in with the lab constantly, pushing for updates, knowing that every hour that passed was another hour Fletcher could disappear. But Fletcher stayed put, either confident the DNA wouldn't match, or simply too tired to run. Finally, in late April 2023, 20 years almost to the day after Mia Calderon disappeared, the call came. The DNA was a match. David Allen Fletcher's DNA had been found on Mia Calderon's clothing, on her pink shorts and white sneakers, evidence that he'd had physical contact with her on the day she was taken. He was arrested the next morning, pulled from his trailer in handcuffs, while neighbors watched from their windows. The arrest made national news. CNN and Fox News both ran breaking news segments. The New York Times published a long-form article about the case and how genetic genealogy was revolutionizing cold case investigations. After 20 years, the case of Mia Calderon was finally moving forward. Fletcher was charged with first-degree kidnapping and first-degree murder, even though Mia's body had never been found, a circumstance that made prosecution more difficult but not impossible. The prosecution argued that the DNA evidence, combined with the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, Fletcher's presence in Yuma at the time of the disappearance, his ownership of a white sedan matching witness descriptions, his complete lack of a verifiable alibi, and his refusal to cooperate with investigators was enough to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense, led by a public defender named Thomas Raines, who'd drawn the short straw, argued that DNA evidence alone wasn't proof of murder, that Fletcher could have come into innocent contact with Mia's clothing somehow, perhaps brushing past her on the street or in a store, and that without a body, without any proof that Mia was even dead, the state couldn't prove murder. The case went to trial in November 2024, 21 and a half years after Mia disappeared. The trial lasted 3 weeks and dominated local news coverage. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and concerned citizens. Rosa Calderon attended every session, sitting in the front row behind the prosecution table, her eyes never leaving Fletcher's face. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses, building their case piece by piece. Mrs. Alvarez testified about seeing the white sedan. Carlos, now in his mid-30s, with a family of his own, testified about seeing the man in the baseball cap. Forensic experts explained the DNA evidence and the genealogy techniques used to identify Fletcher. FBI profilers testified about the typical behavior patterns of child predators. And Rosa Calderon took the stand to testify about the day her daughter disappeared, about the last time she saw Mia alive, about 20 years of not knowing. Rosa's testimony was devastating. She broke down on the stand multiple times, sobbing as she described Mia running out the door, in her pink shorts and white sneakers, full of life and energy, excited to play outside on a hot June afternoon. She described the moment Danny came running in to tell her Mia was gone, the panic that seized her, the desperate search that followed. She described 20 years of birthdays celebrated alone, of keeping Mia's room like a shrine, of leaving the porch light on every night in case her daughter found her way home. By the time she finished testifying, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, and even the judge had to take a moment to compose himself before continuing. Danny testified too, now 30 years old, a father himself, his voice steady, but his eyes filled with pain that hadn't diminished over 2 decades. He described the guilt he'd carried for 20 years, the feeling that he should have been watching his sister more closely, that he could have stopped what happened if only he'd paid more attention. He described how losing Mia had torn his family apart, how his parents' marriage had crumbled under the weight of grief and blame, how he'd spent his childhood and teenage years feeling like a ghost in his own life. The defense called no witnesses, a tactical decision that surprised many courtroom observers. Instead, Raines focused on poking holes in the prosecution's case during cross-examination, questioning the reliability of the genealogy evidence, pointing out that DNA on clothing didn't necessarily prove violence or abduction, arguing that without a body, there was no proof Mia was even dead, suggesting that she might have run away or been taken by someone else entirely. He hammered away at the lack of direct evidence, the absence of eyewitnesses who could place Fletcher at the scene, the 20-year gap between the crime and the arrest. But despite his efforts, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming, and the jury seemed unconvinced by his arguments. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the 4 persons stood to read it. Guilty on all counts: first-degree kidnapping, first-degree murder. David Allen Fletcher was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, 2 consecutive life sentences, to ensure he would never walk free again. As the verdict was read, Rosa Calderon collapsed in the courtroom, overcome with emotion, years of grief and anger and relief pouring out of her in racking sobs. Danny caught her before she fell, held her as she cried, tears streaming down his own face. It wasn't the ending anyone had hoped for. Mia wasn't coming home. She wasn't alive somewhere, waiting to be rescued. But at least there was justice. At least the man who had taken her would spend the rest of his life in prison. At least other children would be safe from him. After the trial concluded, and Fletcher was led away in chains, Detective Marcus Cole sat down with Rosa Calderon in a small conference room at the courthouse to discuss what came next. He told her gently that while the criminal case was over, the investigation wasn't completely finished. They would continue searching for Mia's remains, continue following up on any leads that might reveal where Fletcher had taken her, where she was buried. Cole explained that they would pressure Fletcher to tell them the truth, to give the family the closure of being able to lay Mia to rest properly. But he warned Rosa not to get her hopes too high. Fletcher had remained silent throughout the entire investigation and trial, refusing to testify, refusing to admit any guilt, maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence. It was possible, even likely, that he would never talk, that he would take the location of Mia's body to his grave. Weeks passed, then months. Fletcher said nothing from his cell at the Arizona State Prison in Florence. He refused all interview requests from detectives, from reporters, from criminal profilers who specialized in getting confessions from convicted killers. He sat in his cell, serving his time, keeping his secrets. Then, unexpectedly, in February 2025, Cole got a call from the prison. David Allen Fletcher wanted to talk. Cole's heart raced as he listened to the prison official explain that Fletcher had requested a meeting, that he'd indicated he had information about the Mia Calderon case. Cole didn't allow himself to hope too much, had been disappointed too many times before, but he couldn't ignore the possibility that Fletcher might finally be ready to confess, to tell them where Mia was. Cole drove to the prison the next day, accompanied by an FBI agent who'd worked the original case. They were led through multiple security checkpoints, through corridors lined with cells, to a small interview room where Fletcher sat in handcuffs, looking older and more frail than he had at trial. Prison had aged him rapidly, the hard living catching up to his 60-year-old body. Cole sat across from him and waited, giving Fletcher space to speak first. For a long time, Fletcher just stared at the table, his scarred hands folded in front of him. Then, in a quiet voice that barely carried across the small room, he said 5 words that Cole had been waiting 2 decades to hear. "I'll tell you where she is." Cole pulled out a notepad and pen, his hands trembling slightly with anticipation and dread. Fletcher described a location in the desert, about 30 miles east of Yuma, near a dried-up riverbed that only flowed during monsoon season. He said he'd buried her there the night he took her, that after realizing what he'd done, after the brief moment of clarity that cut through his intoxication and desire, he'd panicked. He'd driven out into the desert with Mia's small body wrapped in a tarp, found a remote spot where no one would think to look, and dug a shallow grave in the hard-packed earth. He said he'd marked the spot in his mind with nearby landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a dead tree struck by lightning, features that wouldn't change over time. He said he'd gone back once, a year after burying her, to make sure no one had discovered the site, and it had remained undisturbed, claimed by the desert. Then, he'd never returned. He claimed he'd regretted it every day since. That guilt had eaten him alive for 20 years. Cole didn't believe the regret, had seen too many killers claim remorse they didn't feel, but he believed the location. Fletcher's description was too specific, too detailed to be fabricated. The next day, a team of investigators, forensic anthropologists, and search specialists drove out to the coordinates Fletcher had provided, a remote section of desert that saw few visitors. They brought ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs specially trained to detect human remains even after decades, and excavation equipment. The desert landscape was desolate, nothing but sand and scrub brush, and rocks for miles in every direction, the kind of emptiness that swallowed secrets. The team worked methodically under the brutal desert sun, scanning the ground with radar, marking areas of interest with small flags, letting the dogs search. Hours passed with no results, and Cole began to worry that Fletcher had lied, that this was one final cruel joke from a dying man. But then, just before sunset, one of the dogs alerted, pacing back and forth near a small depression beneath a mesquite tree, barking insistently. The team converged on the spot immediately, their hearts pounding. They began to dig carefully, treating the site as both a recovery operation and a crime scene, preserving every detail for documentation. The earth was hard, baked by decades of desert heat, making excavation slow and difficult. But 3 feet down, beneath a layer of rocky soil, they found what they'd been searching for. Bones, small bones, a child's skeleton, partially wrapped in the deteriorated remains of a blue tarp, exactly as Fletcher had described. The team stopped digging, marked the exact position, took photographs from every angle. Then they carefully began the process of excavating the remains, working with brushes and small tools, treating the site with the reverence it deserved. As they worked, they found other evidence that had survived burial: scraps of pink fabric, the degraded remains of shorts, the rubber sole of a small sneaker, still recognizably white despite decades underground, a small hair clip, its plastic faded but intact. Each item was photographed, documented, and carefully removed. The remains were carefully excavated and transported to the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office in Phoenix for analysis. DNA testing would confirm what everyone already knew in their hearts, but protocol required verification. The testing took 2 weeks, 2 weeks during which Rosa Calderon waited in agonized suspense, knowing what the results would be, but needing the final confirmation. When the call finally came, when the medical examiner told Cole that the DNA matched, that the remains were definitively those of Mia Calderon, he had to sit down, overwhelmed by the weight of it. After 22 years, Mia was finally coming home. Rosa was notified immediately, Cole driving to her apartment personally to deliver the news. She broke down again when he told her, but this time there was a different quality to her grief. It was still unbearable, still a pain that no parent should ever have to endure, but mixed with it was something else. Relief, strange as that seemed. For 22 years, she hadn't known what happened to her daughter. For 22 years, she'd existed in a state of terrible uncertainty, not knowing if Mia was dead or alive, suffering or at peace. Now she knew. Mia had been gone from the very beginning, taken and killed on that same terrible day. There was no hope left to cling to, no possibility that somewhere out there, Mia was living a different life. But there was also no more wondering, no more imagining worst-case scenarios. The not knowing, which had been in many ways the worst part of it all, was finally over. Mia Calderon was laid to rest in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Yuma on a warm spring morning in March 2025, nearly 22 years after she was taken. The funeral was both an ending and a beginning. Hundreds of people attended, filling the cemetery and spilling out onto the surrounding grounds. Friends and family who had known Mia, investigators who had worked tirelessly on the case, strangers who had followed the story for years and felt connected to this little girl they'd never met. News crews were kept at a respectful distance, filming from behind barriers, capturing the moment for posterity. Rosa stood at the graveside, holding a single white rose, her face aged by grief, but her eyes clear for the first time in 2 decades. She said goodbye to her daughter, whispering prayers in Spanish, telling Mia that she was loved, that she was missed, that she would never be forgotten. Danny stood beside his mother, his arm around her shoulders, supporting her as she'd supported him through countless difficult moments. Miguel was there too, standing off to the side, separated from his ex-wife, but united in grief, his face wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. Detective Cole attended as well, standing at attention in his dress uniform, paying his respects to a little girl whose case had consumed years of his life. Sarah Ortiz was there too, having come out of retirement for this moment, her eyes red as she watched the casket being lowered into the ground. They stood together in silence, the weight of 22 years settling over them, finally able to let go. After the service, as the crowd began to disperse and people lingered to pay their final respects, Rosa placed the white rose on the freshly turned earth and whispered a final prayer. Then she turned and walked away, leaning on Danny for support, ready to begin the long process of healing. The crowd dispersed slowly, people lingering to lay flowers, to say their own private goodbyes, to stand in silent remembrance of a life cut tragically short. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the cemetery grew quiet. Mia's grave was marked with a simple granite headstone that read, Maya Calderon, April 3, 1997, June 14, 2003. Forever in our hearts, beloved daughter and sister. Below the inscription was an image engraved into the stone, a little girl with a ponytail, smiling that same bright smile from her school photo. Rosa had chosen the image herself, wanting people who visited to see not the tragedy of Mia's death, but the joy of her life. In the months that followed, Rosa tried to rebuild her life, to find a new normal in a world without her daughter. She sold the house on East 16th Street, unable to live any longer in the place where Mia had been taken, where every room held memories, both beautiful and heartbreaking. She moved into a small apartment closer to Danny and his family, wanting to be near her grandchildren, to have the sound of children's laughter in her life again. She started going to therapy, something she'd resisted for years, convinced that no therapist could understand what she'd been through. But slowly, week by week, session by session, she began to process the trauma she'd been carrying for more than 2 decades. It wasn't easy. There were still days when the grief was overwhelming, when she couldn't get out of bed, when all she could do was cry and remember. But there were also days when she could smile again, when she could think about Mia without immediately breaking down, when she could remember the good times instead of just the horror of what had happened. She learned to carry her grief differently, to make space for it without letting it consume her entirely. David Allen Fletcher remained in prison, serving his consecutive life sentences at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. After his confession and the recovery of Maya's remains, he gave no further interviews, offered no additional information, showed no remorse beyond his initial admission. For Rosa, that silence was almost as hard to bear as the years of not knowing. She wanted to understand why. Why her daughter? Why that day? What had Mia done to deserve what happened to her? What had gone through Fletcher's mind as he watched her playing in her front yard? But Fletcher had no answers to offer, or if he did, he wasn't sharing them. Prison records showed that he kept to himself, avoided other inmates, spent most of his time alone in his cell. Other prisoners knew what he'd done and made his life difficult in the ways prisoners do to child killers. In the end, Rosa had to accept that she might never fully understand. Some questions don't have satisfying answers. Some wounds never completely heal. But life goes on, and so did Rosa, determined to honor Mia's memory by living as fully as she could. The case of Mia Calderon became a turning point in how law enforcement agencies across the country approached cold cases involving DNA evidence. The successful use of genetic genealogy to solve a decades-old abduction and murder, taking a case that had seemed completely hopeless and bringing it to resolution, demonstrated the power of new technology to bring justice even when traditional investigative methods had failed completely. Other police departments began submitting old DNA evidence to genealogy labs, hoping to solve their own cold cases that had been gathering dust for years or decades. Some succeeded, identifying killers who had long evaded justice. Others didn't, finding that the DNA evidence was too degraded or that the perpetrators had no relatives in genealogy databases. But the Mia Calderon case proved that it was possible, that even after 20 years, even when hope seemed completely lost, answers could still be found, and justice could still be served. For Detective Marcus Cole, solving the case was undoubtedly the highlight of his career, the moment that would define his legacy as an investigator. He'd kept his promise to Sarah Ortiz, kept the case active, kept working leads, even when there seemed to be nowhere left to look. In an interview with the Arizona Republic after the trial concluded, when asked what had kept him going all those years, what had prevented him from giving up like so many others had, he thought for a long moment before answering. "It was Rosa," he said simply. "Every time I thought about closing that file, about moving on to something else that seemed more solvable, I'd think about her sitting on that porch for all those years, waiting for her daughter to come home. I'd think about the hope in her eyes, even after a decade had passed, even after most people had given up. I couldn't let her keep waiting. I had to find answers, whatever it took." And we did. We brought Mia home. Sarah Ortiz, the detective who had started the investigation back in 2003, who had worked the case for 16 years before retirement forced her to step away, watched the trial from the gallery every single day. She was in her 70s by then, her hair completely white, her hands showing the tremor of age, but her mind was as sharp as ever. After the verdict was read, she spoke briefly to reporters gathered outside the courthouse, her voice thick with emotion. She said she wished she could have solved the case herself, wished she could have brought Mia home sooner, before Rosa had to endure 2 decades of not knowing. But she was profoundly grateful that justice had finally been served, that Rosa could finally have some measure of peace. "It's what we do this for," she told the cameras. "Not for the accolades or the headlines or the pats on the back. For the families. For people like Rosa Calderon, who deserve answers, who deserve to know what happened to their loved ones. That's why we keep working these cases, long after everyone else has moved on. Today, years after the resolution of the case, the story of Mia Calderon serves as a powerful reminder of both the terrible evil that exists in the world and the remarkable resilience of those who survive it. Rosa Calderon lost her daughter in the most unimaginable way, had her life torn apart by senseless violence and decades of uncertainty. But she didn't let that loss completely define her, didn't allow the tragedy to destroy her entirely. She kept living, kept hoping, kept fighting for justice, even when it seemed impossible. And in the end, she got what she'd been fighting for. Mia's story didn't end the way anyone wanted it to. She didn't come home alive. She didn't get to grow up, to graduate from high school, to fall in love, to have children of her own, to experience all the milestones that should have been hers. But her story also didn't end in silence and mystery. It ended with answers. It ended with justice. It ended with a mother, finally able to properly grieve, to say a proper goodbye, to lay her daughter to rest with dignity. The people of Yuma haven't forgotten Mia either, even as the years have passed and new stories have replaced old ones in the local news. Every year on June 14th, a small memorial service is held at the cemetery where she's buried, organized by a group of community members who want to ensure she's remembered. Friends and family gather to remember her, to celebrate the brief 6 years of her life, to remind themselves and each other that she mattered, that her life had value beyond the tragedy of how it ended. Children from the neighborhood bring flowers and drawings, colorful pictures of angels and sunshine and hearts. Rosa always attends, standing at the graveside with Danny beside her, now sometimes bringing his own children to meet the aunt they never knew. She talks to Mia during these visits, tells her about what's been happening in the family, about how much she's missed, about how much she's loved. And for a few hours every year, Mia Calderon is remembered not primarily as a victim or a statistic or a cautionary tale, but as a real little girl with dark eyes and a bright smile, who loved cartoons and playing in the yard, and whose life, though short, meant something. The case continues to be studied by law enforcement agencies and criminal justice students, used as an example of both the challenges of cold case investigations and the potential of new forensic technologies. It's been featured in numerous documentaries, podcasts, and true crime shows, examined from every possible angle. People across the country and around the world have followed the story, felt the family's pain, celebrated the eventual resolution. But for those who knew Maya personally, for Rosa and Danny and Miguel, for the neighbors who remembered seeing her play in the yard, for the teachers who had her in class, she's not a case study or a headline or an episode number. She's a real person who was loved deeply and is missed profoundly. And that's exactly how they want her to be remembered. The impact of Mia's case extended far beyond her immediate family and community. The investigation led to policy changes in how quickly Amber Alerts are issued, how DNA evidence is preserved in cold cases, and how genetic genealogy can be ethically used in criminal investigations. Her case helped establish legal precedents that made it easier to prosecute murder cases even without a body, relying on circumstantial and forensic evidence. These changes have helped solve other cases, have brought justice to other families, have prevented other tragedies. In death, Mia's case has saved lives and brought closure to people she never knew. Every June 14th, as the sun sets over the Arizona desert, Rosa Calderon lights a candle in her apartment. She sits in the quiet darkness, watching the flame flicker and dance, and she remembers everything. She remembers Mia's laugh, bright and musical, filling their small house with joy. She remembers her smile, the way it could light up even the darkest days. She remembers the way Mia used to run through the house with boundless energy, never walking when she could skip or run instead. She remembers the good days, all those ordinary moments before the nightmare began, and she holds on to them like precious gems. And she allows herself, for just a brief moment each year, to imagine what Mia's life might have been like if things had been different, who she might have become, what dreams she might have chased, what kind of woman she might have grown into. Would she have been a teacher, like she'd once said she wanted to be? A doctor? An artist? Would she have gotten married, had children of her own, given Rosa more grandchildren? It's a bittersweet exercise, one that brings both profound comfort and deep pain in equal measure. But it keeps Mia alive in Rosa's heart, keeps her memory vivid and real. And that's all a mother can do when her child is gone. Keep their memory alive. Keep their spirit close. And never, ever forget. The case is closed now, the files archived, the questions answered. The monster has been caught, tried, convicted, and locked away where he can never hurt another child. Mia has been found, brought home, and laid to rest with love and dignity. But her story continues to matter, will always matter. It matters because it reminds us that evil exists in the world, that terrible things happen to innocent people for no reason except the depravity of others. But it also reminds us that justice exists too, that good people will fight tirelessly for years, or even decades, to find the truth and bring the guilty to account. It matters because it shows us the power of never giving up, of using every available tool and technique to pursue justice, no matter how much time has passed. It matters because it honors a little girl who deserved so much more than the brief life she got, who should have had the chance to grow up and experience all the wonder and joy and pain and beauty that life offers. And it matters because it gives hope to other families still searching, still waiting, still wondering if their missing loved ones will ever be found. If Mia Calderon can be brought home after 22 years, if her killer can be identified and convicted after more than 2 decades, then maybe, just maybe, others can too. Maybe no case is truly hopeless. Maybe the passage of time doesn't mean the end of the possibility of justice. As the sun rises over Yuma on another summer morning, life in the small bordered town continues much as it always has. The rhythm of daily existence moving forward, regardless of past tragedies. Children play in their yards, innocent and carefree. Parents go to work, worrying about bills and deadlines and ordinary concerns. Neighbors wave to each other across chain-link fences, maintaining the bonds of community. On East 16th Street, the house where it all happened has new owners now. A young couple with 2 small children who don't know about the tragedy that occurred there more than 2 decades ago. Their children laugh and run through the front yard, chasing each other in the Arizona heat, playing the same innocent games that children have always played, living the childhood that Mia Calderon never got to finish. And somewhere, in a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of town, a small granite headstone marks the resting place of a 6-year-old girl whose life was cut horrifically short, but whose memory endures, whose impact continues to ripple outward through the years. Mia Calderon, forever in our hearts, forever remembered, forever loved. The inscription is simple, but it contains everything that matters. She was loved. She is remembered. She will never be forgotten. Rosa's journey through grief was documented by a local therapist who specialized in trauma, Dr. Patricia Chen, who wrote extensively about the unique challenges faced by families of long-term missing persons. In her clinical notes, which Rosa later allowed to be published anonymously in a psychology journal, Dr. Chen described the phenomenon of ambiguous loss, a condition where people grieve for someone whose fate remains unknown. For 20 years, Rosa existed in this liminal space between hope and despair, unable to move forward but unwilling to give up. The recovery of Mia's remains, while devastating, allowed Rosa to finally transition from ambiguous loss to concrete grief, a process that, paradoxically, began her healing. Dr. Chen noted that Rosa's resilience was extraordinary, her ability to continue functioning despite carrying such immense pain for so long. The therapy sessions revealed the depth of Rosa's struggle. The nights when she couldn't sleep because her mind kept replaying that afternoon, wondering if there was something different she could have done, some way she could have saved her daughter. The guilt was overwhelming at times, though rationally, Rosa knew she wasn't responsible for what a monster had chosen to do. Still, the what-ifs haunted her, as they haunt all parents who lose children to violence. The investigation itself became a case study taught at the FBI Academy in Quantico, used to train new agents in the complexities of cold case work and the potential of emerging technologies. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, who had worked the case from the FBI side, gave numerous presentations about how genetic genealogy had transformed their approach to decades-old crimes. She explained to classes of new agents how the technology worked, how DNA collected at a crime scene could be uploaded to genealogy databases and compared against millions of profiles, creating family trees that could eventually lead to a suspect. But she also emphasized the limitations and ethical concerns. The technique worked only if the perpetrator had relatives who had submitted their DNA to these databases. It raised privacy concerns about whether people who innocently submitted DNA to learn about their ancestry should have that information used by law enforcement. And it required enormous amounts of time and resources building family trees that could span hundreds of people and multiple generations. The Mia Calderon case succeeded because all the factors aligned. The DNA evidence was well preserved. Fletcher had a second cousin in the database, and investigators had the funding and time to follow through. But Torres always emphasized to her students that not every case would be so fortunate. Detective Marcus Cole became something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles after solving the case, invited to speak at conferences, and featured in articles about innovative police work. But he always deflected the praise, insisting that he was simply standing on the shoulders of everyone who had worked the case before him. Sarah Ortiz had done the crucial groundwork in those first critical months, interviewing witnesses, collecting evidence, building the case file that Cole would later use. The FBI agents who had worked the case over the years had contributed their expertise and resources. The genealogy lab had done the painstaking work of building family trees and identifying potential suspects. Cole saw himself as simply the last link in a very long chain, the one who happened to be holding the case when the technology caught up to the crime. In his speeches to other detectives, he emphasized the importance of never giving up on cold cases, of preserving evidence even when it seemed useless at the time, because you never knew when new technology or new witnesses might emerge to crack a case wide open. He kept Mia's photo on his desk as a constant reminder, but also added photos of other cold cases he was working, other families still waiting for answers. The trial itself revealed disturbing details about David Allen Fletcher's past that had been hidden for decades. Prosecutors introduced evidence of other suspected crimes, incidents that had never been solved but that bore Fletcher's hallmarks. A 10-year-old girl, who had been approached by a man matching Fletcher's description in Tucson in 2001, but had escaped when a neighbor intervened. A series of break-ins at elementary schools in Southern California in the late 1990s, where nothing was stolen, but children's clothing was taken from lost and found bins. Investigators from multiple jurisdictions testified about unsolved cases involving young girls, cases where Fletcher had lived in the area at the time, but had never been seriously considered as a suspect. The pattern painted a picture of a predator who had been operating for years, possibly decades, successfully evading detection by staying mobile, never staying in one place long enough to draw attention. Mia Calderon might have been his only victim who died, or she might have been one of many. The prosecution's forensic psychologist testified that Fletcher fit the profile of an organized predator, someone who carefully selected victims, planned his attacks, and took steps to avoid detection. His transient lifestyle was itself a form of camouflage, making it nearly impossible for investigators in different jurisdictions to connect the dots. David Fletcher's childhood, revealed through court testimony and psychological evaluations, showed the typical pattern of many serial offenders. He had grown up in a deeply troubled home in rural New Mexico, the youngest of 5 children. His father was an alcoholic who worked sporadically as a ranch hand and frequently beat his children. His mother was described as emotionally distant, overwhelmed by poverty and her husband's violence. Fletcher had been a troubled child, setting fires, torturing animals, showing all the early warning signs that psychologists now recognize as precursors to violent behavior. He dropped out of school at 15 and left home at 16, drifting from town to town across the Southwest, taking odd jobs and sleeping rough. His first arrest came at 19 for breaking into a woman's apartment while she slept, though he fled before assaulting her, and the charges were eventually reduced to trespassing. Over the next 20 years, he accumulated a record of petty crimes, drunkenness, theft, assault, spending short stints in county jails, but never long enough in one place to be seriously scrutinized. The defense tried to use his background to argue for leniency, suggesting that he was a product of his environment, that he himself was a victim of abuse who had never received treatment or intervention. The prosecution countered that thousands of people experienced similar childhoods without becoming killers, that Fletcher had made choices again and again to harm others. The community impact of Mia's case extended far beyond the immediate investigation and trial. Yuma, a town that had considered itself relatively safe despite its border location, was forced to confront the reality that terrible crimes could happen anywhere, that predators existed even in small communities where everyone supposedly knew everyone else. Parents became more protective of their children, more vigilant about who they interacted with and where they played. The schools implemented new safety protocols, requiring ID checks for anyone entering campus and teaching children about stranger danger. Community organizations formed, including a neighborhood watch program on East 16th Street and surrounding blocks. An annual memorial walk was established, held every June in Mia's honor, where participants walked from the Calderon house to the cemetery where she was buried, raising awareness about missing children and funds for victim advocacy organizations. The walk grew larger each year, eventually attracting hundreds of participants from across Arizona. It became a way for the community to remember Mia, while also taking concrete action to protect other children. Danny Calderon's life, after Mia's disappearance, was marked by the same kind of trauma that affected the entire family, but with the added burden of survivor's guilt. In interviews he gave years later, after the case was solved, he spoke candidly about the guilt he carried. He had been 9 years old, playing in the same yard, just feet away when his sister was taken. For years, he tortured himself with what-ifs. What if he had been paying more attention? What if he had insisted Mia stay with him instead of playing on her own? What if he had seen the man approaching and scared him off? Rationally, he knew he was just a child, that he couldn't have prevented what happened. But guilt doesn't respond to rational arguments. He struggled in school after Mia disappeared, his grades dropping, his attention wandering. He got into fights with other kids who made insensitive comments about his missing sister. He started seeing a therapist in middle school, someone who specialized in childhood trauma. And that helped, but the scars remained. As an adult, Danny became a social worker, dedicating his career to helping troubled youth, children in foster care, kids who had experienced trauma. He saw it as a way of honoring Mia, of taking his pain and using it to help others. When he had children of his own, he named his daughter Mia, ensuring that his sister's name would continue in the family. The legal precedent set by the Mia Calderon case had far-reaching implications for how murder prosecutions are conducted in cases where no body is recovered. Traditionally, no-body murder cases were extremely difficult to prosecute because juries were reluctant to convict without definitive proof of death. But advances in forensic science, particularly DNA evidence, and digital forensics, had made it possible to build circumstantial cases strong enough to convince juries beyond a reasonable doubt. The Calderon prosecution presented a comprehensive case combining genetic genealogy, witness testimony, suspect behavior analysis, and forensic evidence to prove not only that Mia was dead, but that Fletcher had killed her. The successful conviction led to changes in prosecutorial strategies across the country. District attorneys who had been reluctant to bring charges in no-body cases began filing them, confident that modern forensic techniques could overcome the traditional barriers. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, began challenging the use of genetic genealogy evidence, arguing that it violated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches, and that people who submitted DNA to ancestry websites never consented to having it used in criminal investigations. These legal battles were still being fought in courts across the country, with the Calderon case frequently cited by both sides. This is the complete story of Mia Calderon. A story of unimaginable tragedy and hard-won triumph. A story of devastating loss and determined justice. A story of a mother's unbreakable love spanning more than 2 decades, and a detective's unwavering determination to find answers no matter how long it took. It's a story that needed to be told completely and truthfully, a life that needed to be remembered fully and honored properly, a case that needed to be solved regardless of the obstacles or the passage of time. And now, finally, after 22 long years of searching and hoping and never giving up, it has been. The desert has given up its secret. The earth has released its terrible hold. And a little girl taken in broad daylight from her own front yard has finally, after more than 2 decades of waiting, come home to rest